So I thought I'd do a little clip about how I would go about post-processing one of my images. This is a 3-pane pano that I shot at dawn, and I've stitched it in Photoshop and just cropped it and pulled it straight in here, done nothing else other than that in Photoshop. This is Capture One. I prefer to use Capture One for my photo editing. So my first task will be to decide how to crop this image, I think, and with the cropping tool I've got a large selection of different aspect ratios that I tend to vary between and use. In this instance I've already had a look at the X-Pan and the Super Panavision, etc., and nothing really fits quite how I like it, so I'm going to go to unconstrained. Now, I don't like the tree on the left, it just feels like a bit of a spare part, so I'm going to crop that out, which is a pity after shooting the panorama, and I'm going to bring the crop in until I get rid of that post in the bottom left corner, which I find irritating. So I'm just going to crop until about that point there, and then the focus is on the two main trees. So the next step in my process would be to decide a film preset. So I have a number of film presets from Mastin Labs. I've grouped them all together here so I can flick between them quickly and easily for comparison, and these are the colour ones, and I'm going to keep this as a colour image. Although it might be quite interesting to look at black and white. And I'm just looking for a starting point, so I'm just flicking through here and looking at these. So I kind of like the Portra 160 and the 800, and I think between the 160 and the 800, I think the 800 is a little bit warmer, and I want to go for the 800. Now, this is the choice that I've got because this is a panorama and it's a TIFF file. However, if this was a single shot from my GFX, Fuji GFX 50R, I'd have another choice. So this shot here was one of the first shots I did in the morning, and I can apply these presets to decide what I like. But I have another choice here because the Fuji cameras have built-in film simulations of their own. So I can get to those by this base characteristics. You can see it's the 50R and the curve is the linear response at the moment. But if I click on that, I've got a whole host of different film simulations that are Fuji film simulations. So if this was a single shot, I would be flicking through these, trying to look for one of these that I like, as well as the Mastin Labs ones. So I know from forums that the classic chrome, the negative, and the classic negative and the eternal are quite popular choices. I like these ones as well. I sometimes use these. In this case, because I'm looking at doing this panorama, go back to the panorama at the bottom. Those options are not here. I don't have them. So I'm going to go back to the Mastin Labs. I've chosen Portra 800, but rather than selecting it here, I'm going to actually go to the Portra folder and select the 800 because I've got subsettings to set here. So this is clearly a daylight shot, so I'm going to select daylight, but you can see how it affects if I choose open shade or tungsten. It changes the color balance. Next we get into the tone, and you can select all hard or all soft. You can see the image changing quite dramatically. In this situation, I'm going to look at the highlights, and I'm going to individually select the highlights and the shadows. So if you look at the sky, I personally prefer the slightly darker sky, so I'm going to go for the soft. And in the shadows, I'm really looking at the trees in the background, and I prefer the darker trees, so I'm going to go for hard on the shadows. Lens correction is meaningless in this case because it's a TIFF file and it's a panorama that's been stitched, so I'm just going to ignore that. And I then have the choice of adding grain. If you look at the sky area up here, you can see as I mouse over the grain, you can see it popping in and going out. I'll do it a few times. Oops, off, on, off, on. And the medium format is just a finer grain effectively. I would quite often use grain, but in this case I'm not going to. So that's my initial selections, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty now. So I've already got an idea of how I want to change this image, or how I want to process this image. I've got the sun coming in from the right, so I've got warmth coming in from the right, and it'd be chasing the night sky away, which is towards the left, or it would be towards the left if I'd shot it a little bit earlier. So the left is going to be cool, the right is going to be warm. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a couple of layers that I can play around with. So I'm going to create a layer. It's 1, 2, 3. I want 3 layers. So the first one I'm going to call warm right, because that's where the sun's coming from. The second one I'm going to call cool left. And the last one I'm going to call vignette. So that's just set up my layers that I can have then play around with. So I'm going to go to warm right. In fact, what I'm going to first do is on background, I'm just going to lower the exposure a fraction. Looks better already. So warm right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drag a graduated filter across the screen, and I'm going to pull the filter on. So anything red, that's where the effect of this layer is going to action on. So the filter effect is going to be to the right. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the white balance to make it warmer on the right. So if I pull this to the right, you'll see that the right is starting to get pinker and warmer. So I don't want to go too far. I want to go quite a long way, but not too far. So I'm going to leave it there for the time being. Might have to tweak that a little bit later. And then I'm going to go to the cool left. I'm going to do exactly the same. Drag out a mask. Drag it a little bit further to the center way. And I'm going to cool the left-hand side. So this creates a little bit of, if I go right to the extreme, you'll see it gets really cool on that side, but I don't want to go quite that far. So I've got, that will do. So I'm creating a gradient in the white balance between the right hand side, the warm side, and the left side, which is going to be the cool side. And this is just personal preference, there's no right or wrong, but I prefer in an image like this to turn the sky to a slightly more teal colour. I'll settle for that for the time being. So that looks a bit too harsh at the moment, but we might smooth that out in a bit. So that's my first step. I'm then going to go and add a vignette, and this is going to be a radial vignette, and it's going to be an elliptical one. And if I put the M on, you can see where it's actually the mask is taking effect. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this across. In this case, this is a bit unusual because I've got the sun coming in from the right hand side, right corner. So I'd like it to be a bit like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull down the exposure. So I'm going to darken the right hand side of the image, and it looks like there's a bit of a line developing there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that a smoother, less harsh gradient. Got to be careful because I want to try and not have much of a gradient up here. So I'm going to pull this across a little bit more and up. And what we can do is now pull this out a fraction more, and that looks a lot smoother to my eyes. And already we're getting a bit of a smoothness between the pink, it's a little bit too extreme for me at the moment, into the cool darkness to the left. I could add another one where I just have a linear gradient going across and just progressively darken the left hand side, but I'm quite happy with that. In fact, I'm going to take that down just a fraction more. And I'm going to go back to the background and I'm going to apply some sharpening. So I'm going to find part of that tree. Let's go to an area here of interest. I'm going to use this. I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to start applying some sharpening to that. We don't need too much. That's too much, you see, and that's not enough. So just doing it by eye. So I'm happy with it, which I'm reasonably happy with that. And I'm going to go back and address that. It's just a little bit too pink. So I'm going to take the tint and I'll just play gently with the tint until I get it just turning the blue into a sort of slight pinky warm shade. You can see the effect quite strongly there. And what I might do now is I go back to the select the gradient mask, and it feels like it's just in this right corner. I want it to be a bit more central, so I'm going to drag this across a little bit to try and warm up more of the image, get a little bit better balanced maybe. There we go. And I'm going to do the reverse of the cool one. I'm going to pull that back a fraction because it's a little bit, that's a little bit better, I think. So we've got warm going to the dark. And I'm going to tweak the exposure, I think, a little bit, just a fraction. And that is about it. Now sometimes I would play around with, I'm going to zoom in and pull up a fraction. So sometimes I would play around with the structure and the clarity, but I don't think I'm going to in this case. I think that's just going to make it a little bit more in your face. So I'm going to put that back to neutral, and the same with structure. Sometimes you can do some nice things with structure, but I don't particularly like what it's doing to the image in this case. So there we have it. In fact, I'm just going to tweak the vignette again. Just a taste. Maybe brighten up overall, bring that back up. I'll turn that off and go back to the vignette, darken that. Just a question of keep on tweaking it until you're happy. Yeah, so that's me done. And I've got a recipe here which is just for a JPEG. And that's it. I think that might be a little bit too dark on the left, so I'm going to redo that. Go back to the vignette, and we're just going to lighten that up a fraction on that side. It's a little bit too extreme. Redo that process. And that is it. Job done.